Okay, ninth and 10th grade world literature. We're going to hit a couple more fairy tales today. We're going to start with Little Snow White, which is very different from the story that you're used to. I can guarantee that very few people have read even close to the original stories. Then we're going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to do another slideshow that is about another fairy tale, and I'll reveal that when we come back. Okay, so let's start with Little Snow White by the Grimm brothers. I want you to note that in this fairy tale, there are going to be a few motifs. Those are repeated ideas, and I really push the idea of a motif quite a lot because I want you to start recognizing them. And then I also want to introduce you to the term tropes. And we hear tropes quite a lot when it comes to movies, television shows, and especially comic books. We hear tropes quite a lot in superhero fantasy. A trope is a metaphor that stands for something else, and usually it's for a very significant idea. Okay, for instance, we could look at I forgot his name, but anyway, Captain America. He is a metaphor for something else. What is he a metaphor for? He's Captain America. He's standing in for the patriotic American who went to war in World War II. He is the ultimate super soldier. So we have one person standing in for many other people. But you can have metaphors for just about anything, and we have the tropes. Okay, most of you already know I'm a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I love the TV show. It is my favorite TV show. And I like the spin-off Angel as well. But when I think of tropes, I think of how that was invented in the first place. The man who wrote the original movie and came up with the idea of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was Joss Whedon. And he was frustrated at a trope he saw in horror movies, and that trope was a girl walking through an alley at night and being attacked by the big bad monster, and she's just running and finds herself getting killed. She finds herself getting killed. She ends up getting killed by this big bad monster, and that was the trope. And the trope that it represents, it stands for something else, is finding yourself alone, finding yourself running, knowing that you're not going to win that race, you're not going to be safe, and still running. And the trope also of the big bad taking out the poor defenseless person, the might versus right, or might and right argument. So he decided to take that trope and twist it, turn it around, turn it on its head. And his plan was somewhere in the movie, somewhere in the TV show, there would be a time when a cute blonde girl's walking down an alley, the monster attacks her, and she fights back and wins. That's the difference, okay? And from that, we get a whole different trope. We have the warrior woman trope. We have the idea of the girl going out and taking care of herself and taking out the bad guys. And so when I watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because a lot of it's based on fantasy and superheroes, because she is a superhero, I see these metaphors, I see these tropes. And even the trope of high school being hard, difficult, almost hellish, because her high school's on a hellmouth. I just finished reading a book this week called Twisted, where the main character is going through his life as if he is going through the levels of hell. It's based on Dante's Inferno. So this is a trope, the idea that you are going through a personal kind of hell, a punishment. You're just kind of working through it so that you can get through to the other side. Because in Dante's Inferno, he goes down into 9 levels of hell and then comes out the other side for the is it Purgatorio? It goes 9 levels of hell. Yeah, then it's Purgatorio. I haven't read Purgatorio yet, but I did just read Dante's Inferno last month. So when we're reading fairy tales, we need to look for the motifs. Those are repeated ideas. We need to look for the tropes. Those are metaphors that stand for something else, and usually much more significant ideas. And as you read, it's a good idea, no matter what book you have, unless you've borrowed the book, you can write in your books, and I fully encourage you to do that. I color or draw in my books as well. Underline, make notes of the motifs that you recognize. And as for your tropes, pay close attention to colors. I'm teaching introduction to poetry for another class, and we spent a long time talking about colors and what they stand for. Look for glass. It is see-through, and yet there's a barrier there. There's reflective surfaces because it shows you who that person really is. And then as you read, make notes about what they might mean. Be prepared to discuss them in class. Well, we can't discuss them in class, but you can discuss them with your family members. You can discuss them with other people in your class. You can text each other, email, whatever. Okay, so this gives us an opportunity to start looking beyond the most basic part of the fairy tale, just listening to the story and finding out the motifs that go behind it. By the way, the second book I read by the same author who wrote Twisted was called Winter Girls, and she took the idea of fairy tales and had the girl who is going through an issue with anorexia feeling like she was locked up in a glass coffin. And she's constantly referring to fairy tales, being stuck in a tower, being encased in glass, feeling like nobody can really hear you or help you, and just trying to live in this world where you live in one section and the rest of the world lives in another, and neither of the two shall meet. So it was really interesting, the same author using these very different motifs for her books to talk about the teenage life. Okay, they're both YA books. Okay, so let's start with Little Snow White by the Grimm brothers. This is the version I grew up with. Big shock. So the first time I watched Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney version, I kept shaking my head like, what? That's what? Huh? What? So the Disney version, after a while, I just had to accept that Walt Disney changed it dramatically to make it into a romance. Little Snow White is definitely not a romance story. But the Disney version definitely is. That's a center point for that story. I do like the movie Snow White, and we did own it when my kids were growing up, but neither of my boys really enjoyed it all that much because the queen scared the snot out of them. I mean, into high school years. And I'm talking about my son who loves horror movies. When we would go to Disneyland and he was a teenager, didn't like to go on Snow White's scary, the scary ride. Snow White's scary. It was, she was going through the woods. He hated that one because there's a scene in there where the queen turns around and she turns into the evil witch, and that just used to, he hated that. Okay, and I thought that was kind of funny. I'm a terrible parent. Okay, just laughing at my kid going, ah! So let's talk about Little Snow White. Once upon a time in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a queen sat sewing at her window, which had a frame of black ebony wood. As she sewed, she looked up at the snow and pricked her finger with her needle. The 3 drops of blood fell into the snow. The red on the white looked so beautiful that she thought to herself, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood in this frame. Okay, so there we have our first metaphors, our first tropes. Okay, the black, the red, and the white. It wasn't just for the 80s. Those were the 3 main colors for the 80s. So she accidentally pricks her finger. 3 drops fall in the snow. We see the motif of 3 all the time, and that's also a trope because you have to remember that this is during medieval times when a lot of this was written, or just post-medieval times when there's still a lot of religious superstition and concern concerning the Trinity and heaven, hell, and earth. I mean, all of these are part of that. So she's also looking up the colors. The black of the wood. Ebony is a very, very expensive wood that would have had to be shipped in. It is a very deep black. In fact, early piano keys were made out of ebony. And then her white cloth, the linen cloth, And the snow, there's that purity there. And then, of course, the red, which is a passion that is there. And so she looks at this and she says, if only had a child that had all three of these colors. Soon afterwards, she had a little daughter who was white as snow, red as blood, and black as ebony wood. This is translated into very fair skin, red lips, and black hair. Okay. Which is a little unusual for the day because blonde hair, especially in more Western Europe, was prized. But wherever this took place, the black hair was definitely a prized thing. So therefore, they called her Little Snow White. And as soon as the child was born, the queen died. Oh, that's a bummer. But here is the thing. When it comes to stories, we have to have that conflict right away or we don't have a story. We have to have a conflict. We have to find a way to get our characters to move forward. You may have watched a TV show or a movie where everything seems to be going really well, especially in long storytelling TV shows. We will have characters who are doing really well, they're on top and you feel really good for them, and then all of a sudden something bad happens and they have to start all over again trying to rebuild their lives. And Mr. S gets really frustrated by that, and I kind of smile when he starts ranting about that because I like to hear him rant about TV shows. And then I think to myself, it's only because if they kept that character in that good place for too long, it would get boring. They have to have a conflict to move them forward. You always move forward in conflict when it comes to literature. So the little girl's born, the mom gets her wish, the mom dies. It's not just Disney that kills off the parents. Okay, so let's go on to the next page, which is a year later, the king took himself another wife. That was pretty normal. She was a beautiful woman, but she was proud and arrogant, and she could not stand it if anyone might surpass her in beauty. She had a magic mirror. Every morning she stood before it, looked at herself, and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" To this the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew the mirror spoke the truth. She doesn't think the mirror speaks the truth just because he says she's pretty. She knows that mirrors speak the truth no matter what. Did you catch that? She's looking into the mirror knowing that whatever the mirror is reflecting back to her is true. All mirrors do this. In fact, somebody wrote a poem, Sylvia Plath wrote a poem called The Mirror, which is all about how the mirror is like, here I am just stuck to the wall. I tell the truth and people cry over me. I tell the truth and they cry. They start pulling at their faces, trying to make me, tell a different story, but I'm only telling the truth. So the queen here is looking in the mirror. She's looking for the truth. Catch it? So she's doing this every morning. Keep in mind that when she's first married to the king, Snow White is 1 year old. So she's a baby girl. Now, Snow White grew up and became ever more beautiful. When she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the light of day, even more beautiful than the queen herself. One day, when the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" it answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true. But Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." At age 7, this little girl was so much more beautiful than her stepmother that she became known as being 1,000 times more beautiful than the queen. The queen took fright. She's afraid of not being the most beautiful and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour on, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart turned over inside her body. So great was her hatred for the girl. Now, hearts don't literally turn over, but they do palpitate, and it can feel like it's turning over. The envy and pride grew ever greater, like a weed in her heart, until she had no peace day or night. This is really, truly sad that a grown woman would be jealous of a 7-year-old, but this is exactly what we're dealing with in this story. Then she summoned a huntsman and said to him, "Take Snow White out into the woods. I never want to see her again. Kill her." You got to be really jealous to want to kill somebody for their beauty when you're talking about a 7-year-old or anybody for that matter. Kill her, and as proof that she is dead, bring her lungs and liver back to me. That is specific. The huntsman obeyed and took Snow White into the woods. He took out his hunting knife and was about to stab it into her innocent heart when she began to cry, saying, "Oh, dear huntsman, let me live. I will run into the wild woods and never come back." Because she was so beautiful, the huntsman took pity on her, and he said, "Run away, you poor child." He thought, the wild animals will soon devour you anyway. But still it was as if a stone had fallen from his heart, for he would not have to kill her. So the huntsman's going to obey the queen. He's going to kill this 7-year-old child, but her begging him not to really works on him, and he says, yeah, just go run away. And then his thought is, well, I won't have to kill her, but she'll definitely die out here as a 7-year-old in the woods. Just then a young boar came running by. He killed it, cut out its lungs and liver, and took them back to the queen as proof of Snow White's death. The cook had to boil them with salt, and the wicked woman ate them, supposing she had eaten Snow White's lungs and livers. She is into cannibalism here, but there is a background for this. I know. Okay, a lot of these stories are from Europe, where the Celts and the Franks lived. These are individual little tribes of people, but the Celts particularly, and the Franks as well, and several of the Saxon groups who lived in Germany, they had in ancient times a practice where they would kill somebody in battle, and they would cut off their head and use the skull for a drinking cup. Not kidding. The purpose of this, they were basically headhunters, was they believed that if they conquered someone who was strong and who was very adept at war, and they were able to take a part of their body away with them, they in turn would capture the strength of that warrior that they had killed in battle. So having a drinking cup made out of somebody's skull, they would coat it in gold, line it with gold and drink out of it. And the idea that you could take somebody's strength from them by taking some of their hair or a body part. Later on, the Catholic Church also did this with saints, that when a saint died, their teeth were pulled, their fingers were taken off, and those fingers and the teeth that were removed from saints, people who were considered to have lived an above and beyond great measure in their life, who were truly godly, those little items were called relics. And those relics were very, very powerful. They allowed people access to the saint in heaven, and then the saint would pray to God for them. So this idea had been around for quite a long time. So it really isn't that strange that the queen would eat a portion of her stepdaughter, even though it's icky and even though it's full-on cannibalism. The reason for this, why would she eat the lungs and the liver of this 7-year-old? Because the 7-year-old was beautiful. And if you take into account the other reasons for this kind of mutilation of the bodies, you can see that the queen is trying to ingest the beauty of this little girl. She's trying to become as beautiful as this little girl was. It's not just, she's my enemy, I'll show her. No, she's trying to ingest that beauty as well. Weird, but, understandable in this context. The poor child was now all alone in the great forest, and she was so afraid that she just looked at all the leaves on the trees and did not know what to do. Then she began to run. So we get this idea of panicking. She ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and wild animals jumped at her, but they did her no harm. She ran as far as her feet could carry her, and just as evening was about to fall, she saw a little house and went inside to rest. Inside the house, everything was small, but so neat and clean that no one could say otherwise. There was a little table with a white tablecloth and 7 little plates, and each plate had a spoon, and there were 7 knives and forks and 7 mugs as well. Against the wall, there were 7 little beds, all standing in a row and covered with snow white sheets. kind of like she's Snow White. The sheets were Snow White as well. Shows the cleanliness. Her white skin is supposed to show her innocence. But you realize this is all one room. Okay, so you have basically one great room, and you've got the dining table and then the beds along another wall. Because she was so hungry and thirsty, Snow White ate a few vegetables and a little bread from each little plate, and from each mug she drank a drop of wine. Afterwards, because she was so tired, she lay down on a bed, but none of them felt right. One was too long, the other too short, until finally the seventh one was just right. She remained lying in it, and trusted herself to God and fell asleep. If this sounds at all familiar, it should. We have another retelling of this in Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Little girl finds a house in the woods, eats from everybody's bowl, and then tries everybody's bed and then falls asleep in the last bed. So yeah, we see that motif happening again. After dark, the masters of the house returned home. They were 7 dwarfs who picked and dug for ore in the mountains. They lit their 7 candles, and as soon as it was light in their house, they saw that someone had been there, for not everything was in the same order as they had left it. The first one said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" The second one, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third one, "Who's been eating my bread?" The fourth one, "Who's been eating my vegetables?" The fifth one, "Who's been sticking with my fork?" The sixth one, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh one, "Who has been drinking from my mug?" Then the first one saw that there was a little imprint on his bed, and he said, "Who stepped on my bed?" The others came running up and shouted, "Someone has been lying in mine as well." But the seventh one, looking at his bed, found Snow White lying there asleep. The 7 dwarfs all came running up, and they cried out with amazement. They fetched their 7 candles and shone the light on Snow White. "Oh, good heaven! Oh, good heaven!" they cried. "This child is so beautiful." They were so happy they did not wake her, but let her continue to sleep there in the bed. The 7th dwarf had to sleep with his companions, 1 hour with each one, and then the night was done. The next morning Snow White woke up, and when she saw the 7 dwarfs, she was frightened. But they were friendly and asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How did you find your way to our house?" the dwarfs asked further. Then she told them that her stepmother had tried to kill her, that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run the entire day, finally coming to their house. The dwarfs said, "If you will keep house for us and cook, make beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then you can stay with us, and you shall have everything you want." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." Okay, she's a 7-year-old girl, but she's plenty old enough to do chores around the house. This is exactly what these 7 dwarfs are telling her. Now, they already keep a very neat and tidy little house. It's not like Snow White and the 7 dwarfs from Disney, where she has to clean everything up to make it livable. These men are actually very particular. And so here she is. She's being asked, if you want to stay here, do you want to stay here? If you do, you have to do chores. And so they give her a list of chores that she's responsible for. And she says, "Yes, I will. With all my heart, I will do this." So she kept house for them. Every morning they went into the mountains to look for ore and gold. In the evening, when they came back home, their meal had to be ready. During the day, the girl was alone, so she had her free time to do her jobs. The good dwarfs warned her, saying, "Be careful about your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Do not let anyone in." Now the queen, believing she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver, could only think she was again the first and most beautiful woman of all. She stepped before her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" It answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true. But Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs, is still 1,000 times fairer than you." Okay, sometimes you just want to break that mirror and say, "Dude, what are you giving it away for?" But remember, he can only tell the truth. That's what mirrors do. The startled queen, for she knew the mirror did not lie, because no mirror does, and she realized that the huntsman had deceived her and that Snow White was still alive. Then she thought and thought again how she could kill Snow White, for as long as she was not the most beautiful woman in the entire land, her envy would give her no rest. At last she thought of something. Coloring her face, so she puts on makeup, so that she disguised herself as an old peddler woman. so that no one would recognize her. In this disguise, she went to the house of the seven dwarfs. Knocking on the door, she called out, "Beautiful wares for sale, for sale." So she's going out like a peddler woman. That's a door-to-door salesperson. Snow White peered out the window and said, "Good day, dear woman. What do you have for sale?" Remember, she was told, don't leave the house. But she's opening the window and looking out. "Good wares, my beautiful wares," she answered. "Bodice laces in all colors." The bodice is exactly what you see here in this picture. It's basically a top or a blouse. This bodice is shown as a type of almost a corset, but it's more decorative. It's worn on the outside of the clothes. Bodice laces, just like shoelaces, in all colors, and she took one out that was braided from colorful silk. "Would you like this one?" "I can let the honest woman in," thought Snow White. So she was told not to go out, but she doesn't have a problem letting people in. "I can let this honest woman in," thought Snow White, then unbolted the door and bought the pretty bodice lace. "Child," said the old woman, "how you look! Come, let me lace you up properly." She's 7, but the older woman is saying, "You're old enough to start cinching in that waistline, Miss Thing." So she says, "Let's get you, straightened up. Let's put your your clothing in proper order. You need to dress appropriately. So let's lace you up in this bodice." The unsuspecting Snow White stood before her and let her do up the new lace, but the old woman pulled so quickly and so hard that Snow White could not breathe. That was the problem with corsets. They would be pulled so tight that women would actually pass out quite a lot because they didn't have enough room in their lungs to pull in enough oxygen. "You used to be the most beautiful one," said the old woman, and hurried away. Not long afterward, in the evening time, the seven dwarfs came home. How terrified they were when they saw their dear Snow White lying on the ground, not moving at all, as though she were dead. They lifted her up, and seeing that she was too tightly laced, they cut the lace in two. Then she began to breathe a little, and little by little she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else but the godless queen. Take care and let no one in when we are not with you." When the wicked woman returned home, she went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered once again, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White beyond the mountains with the seven dwarfs is still 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard that, all her blood ran to her heart because she knew that Snow White had come back to life. "This time," she said, "I shall think of something that will destroy you." Then, with the art of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisoned comb, which, oddly enough, the phrase for witch in the Old Testament in the Hebrew is actually poisoner when you translate it. Interesting. Then she disguised herself, taking the form of a different old woman. Thus she went across the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked on the door, and called out, "Good wares for sale, for sale." Snow White looked out and said, "Go on your way. I'm not allowed to let anyone in. "You surely may take a look," said the old woman, pulling out the poisoned comb and holding it up. The child liked it so much that she let herself be deceived and opened the door. After they had agreed on the purchase, the old woman said, "Now, let me comb your hair properly. This is a 7-year-old girl. She can take care of the house, do her little chores and everything, but, personal hygiene is something that is learned over time. Now, let me comb your hair properly." She had barely stuck the comb into Snow White's hair when the poison took effect and the girl fell down unconscious. "You specimen of beauty," said the wicked woman, "now you are finished," and she walked away. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as if she were dead, they immediately suspected her stepmother. They examined her and found the poisoned comb. They had scarcely pulled it out when Snow White came to herself again and told them what had happened. Once again, they warned her to be on guard and not to open the door for anyone. Back at home, the queen stepped before her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair. It's true. But Snow White beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs is still 1,000 times fairer than you." When the queen heard the mirror saying this, she shook and trembled with anger. "Snow White shall die," she shouted, "if it costs me my life." Then she went into her most secret room. No one else was allowed inside, and she made a poisoned apple. 2 poisons. From the outside, it was beautiful, white with red cheeks, and anyone who saw it would want it. But anyone who might eat a little piece of it would die. Did you catch the red and the white there? Okay, then coloring her face, she disguised herself as a peasant woman, and thus went across the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked on the door. Snow White struck her head out the window and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in. The dwarfs have forbidden me to do so." "That's all right with me," answered the peasant woman. "I'll easily get rid of my apples. Here, I'll give you one of them." "No," said Snow White, "I cannot accept anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" asked the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in two. You eat the red half, I shall eat the white half." Okay, so she doesn't open the door this time. She doesn't invite the woman in, but she is speaking to her through the window. And at this point, the peddler woman is like, "Are you afraid of poison? You eat the white part, or I'll eat the white part. You eat the red half." So she's talking about, I'll eat the skin, or you can eat the skin part, and I'll eat the white. Now, the apple had been so artfully made that only the red half was poisoned. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and when she saw that the peasant woman was eating part of it, she could no longer resist and stuck her hand out and took the poisoned half. She barely had the bite in her mouth when she fell to the ground, dead. The queen looked at her with a gruesome stare, laughed loudly, and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. This time the dwarfs cannot awaken you." Back at home, she asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" It finally answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." Then her envious heart was at rest, as well as an envious heart can be at rest. Because envious hearts can never be at rest. There's always something to be envious about. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground. She was not breathing at all. She was dead. They lifted her up and looked for something poisonous. They undid her laces. They combed her hair. They washed her with water and wine, but nothing helped. The dear child was dead, and she remained dead. They laid her on a bier. A bier is a platform on which a dead body is resting. And all 7 sat next to her and mourned for her and cried for 3 days. Wink, wink. They were going to bury her, but she still looked as fresh as a living person and still had her beautiful red cheeks. They said, "We cannot bury her in the black earth," and they had a transparent glass coffin made so she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside and with golden letters wrote on it her name and that she was a princess. Then they put the coffin outside on a mountain, and one of them always stayed with it and watched over her. The animals, too, came and mourned for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and finally a dove. Okay, so we have her being laid out for 3 days on this bier, just as Jesus was dead for 3 days and then rose again. So it's foreshadowing that she is going to be resurrected. I know you guys know the story, so I'm not really spoiling anything. And then they put her in a glass coffin, put her outside, and even the animals come. The owl, representing wisdom, the raven, other than death and spirits, I don't really know that the raven would have anything else. And then a dove for peace. Snow White lay there in the coffin a long, long time, and she did not decay, but looked like she was asleep. For she was still as white as snow, red as blood, and black-haired as ebony wood. Now it came to pass that a prince entered these woods and happened onto the dwarf's house, where he sought shelter for the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain with beautiful Snow White in it, and he read what was written on it with golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you anything you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We would not sell it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Then give it to me, for I cannot live without being able to see Snow White. I will honor her and respect her as my most cherished one." Now, in some editions of this, the prince is actually a collector. He likes to collect odd things from around the world. But he sees this beautiful princess, even though she's a very little girl, in this glass coffin. And he decides, I want her. I want to take her coffin and with me. As he thus spoke, the good dwarfs felt pity for him and gave him the coffin. The prince had his servants carry it away on their shoulders, but then it happened that one of them stumbled on some brush, and this dislodged from Snow White's throat the piece of poisoned apple she had bitten off. Not long afterwards, she opened her eyes and lifted the lid from her coffin, sat up, and was alive again. There's no holy kiss here because she's 7. "Good heavens, where am I?" she cried out. The prince said joyfully, "You are with me." And he told her what had happened and then said, "I love you more than anything else in this world. Come with me to my father's castle. You shall become my wife." Snow White loved him and she went with him. Their wedding was planned with great splendor and majesty. Let me just explain this before everybody starts getting creeped out. Yes, she was still a child, but it was very common back in those days where a princess would go and live in her husband's castle with his family, and she would be raised by his family to live as a member of the family. She would be trained in all of the family traditions and learn about the family's history. And so she would be raised in the palace, the same palace her husband was in. They would be they wouldn't actually be husband and wife and living together and sleeping together and having children together until she was of age. Okay, so this isn't as creepy as it's coming across. So it's going to take a while for that wedding to be planned, and there's going to be a great splendor and majesty. And now they're also out of the kingdom where Snow White was raised. Snow White's godless stepmother was also invited to the feast when it's finally time for this celebration to happen. After putting on her beautiful clothes, she stepped before the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" So she's visiting this other land, and she says, "Who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." The wicked woman uttered a curse, and she became so frightened that she did not know what to do. Why would she be frightened? Because it's the same terms, the same tone, the same prophecy that the mirror had given about Snow White. And she knew that Snow White was dead for years. But now she's being told the exact same thing. At first, she did not want to go to the wedding, but she found no peace. She had to go and see the young queen. She's got to see, is it really Snow White? When she arrived, she recognized Snow White, and terrorized, she could only stand there without moving. Then they put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. So the evil queen comes in. She sees the child, all grown up now, and a bride that she had tried to kill 4 different times, and is now looking at these and just standing there terrorized. She knows that she's been recognized, and she knows that the people there understand what she has done. And so this form of torture is really unreal. This is an actual photograph of iron shoes, so it was a real thing. They would do exactly what they say in this fairy tale. They would get them heated up until they were red hot, and then they would force the convict, the person who's being punished, in to wear the shoes. It was the shock to the system as well as the pain that would eventually kill the person who was in the shoes. And so the idea of her dancing until she fell down dead, I doubt she did any dancing at all, but sounds good. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I'm going to take just a really fast break. I'll meet you back here for the next lecture today, and we're going to be doing another story. And this one won't be about a girl. I'm trying to split them up so that we have, boy fairy tales and girl fairy tales. They're really for everybody, but, I'm talking about the main character here. Okay, so I will see you next class. Bye.